The modern world is very like the 18th century. People keep saying, oh, we're going back to the 1930s, but you have, in geopolitical terms, even the same territory being partitioned. We call it Ukraine today, but it was Poland in her day. The fact that there's a massive debate now in Europe on how to modernize and finance an army, alliances which seemed set in stone in the 18th century. No one ever thought Austria would form an alliance with France. In the same way today, no one ever thought that Russia and America would seem to be forming an entente at the very least.
Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So your new book charts a very impressive empress and her instigating of the Austrian Enlightenment. In the mid-1700s, how big was the Austrian Empire and what sort of power did it wield in the world?
It dominated through the Holy Roman Empire, whose sovereigns were nearly always drawn from the Austrian imperial family, the House of Austria, the Habsburgs. It dominated most of the German-speaking parts of Europe. It had its tentacles also in northern Italy, and indeed what is today Belgium was the Austrian Netherlands. So it was, along with France, you could say, the major power in Europe.
So when you go about writing a book and choosing a subject, to what extent is it intrinsically motivated? And to what extent do you have to keep your eye on the economics of book selling and choose subjects which will sell well?
Well, I'm very lucky. I haven't I haven't had to sort of write books wondering where my next check is coming from. I worked for 25 years in a commercial environment, so I have only written books on subjects which interest me, and indeed subjects which I can be enthusiastic about. So some people might accuse me of hagiography. I certainly couldn't have written about Maria Theresa unless I was a fan of hers. And she, the more I researched her character, the more I read her letters, the more I realized that she was, in fact, one of the most amazing personalities ever to stride across the European stage.
And what was it that she did that made her such an amazing character and have such an amazing reign?
Well, where does one begin? I think let's start at the beginning. She's 23 when she comes to the throne. Her advisors are all old, incompetent men. They all say to her, you've got no money left in your treasury. Your best generals are in prison because they were incompetent in the recent campaign against the Ottomans. And if anyone wants to take a slice of your imperial domains away, you should sit down round the table with them and give them exactly what they want. And to her credit, at the age of 23, she said, these old people have to go. And fortunately for me, I think some of them are about to die. But if they hadn't been sort of carted off the mortal coil, who knows what she would have done, she said later. So she resisted all the advice to give in. She then set about rebuilding her treasury and getting the sinews of war so that she could modernize her army. And then she realized that modernizing an army is not enough. You have to modernize the entire state. And you have to ensure that in the first instance, your priority is, as it should be for every sovereign, improving the lot of your subjects. And your subjects must be left in a much better condition when you leave your crown lands than when you found them. And that was her overarching aim, as it should be the aim of any head of state, to leave the country in better condition than you come to it. And you can see that obviously in these rather turbulent times, that's rather more difficult to achieve than in Maria Theresa's time.
Is there something better suited, do you think, as a professional historian, of the female disposition to the role of a monarch and an empress? So if we look certainly to our British history, we have arguably our best monarchs were all women: Elizabeth I, Victoria, and Elizabeth II. What's your take on that as a professional historian?
Well, one of the things I discuss in the book is that there was quite a lot of debate at the time, in the middle of the 18th century, on the suitability of women to be leaders, to be monarchs. And you had some of the best minds alive in 18th century Europe pontificating on this. And the general consensus was that for various reasons, some physical, some emotional, some psychological, women were extremely well suited to being sovereigns. First, because through the challenges of childbirth, they were physically much more robust than many male monarchs. And secondly, because of their perceived frailty as the weaker sex, so called, they were, of course, also uh, allowed to choose their mostly male advisors rather than have them imposed on them. And so, if they were fortunate enough to have the gift of discernment, they could choose some extremely good and useful and indeed highly intelligent advisors. And that, in the case of Maria Theresa, was what she did. She assembled some of the best brains in Central Europe around her.
So you said she had incredible discernment. To what extent was that a environment of her upbringing, and to what extent was that just her naturally being rather discerning and rather wise?
Well, she was trained by the Jesuits, and the discernment is a big part of a Jesuitical formation. Um, and I think that is partly the explanation, but she had tremendous intuition. She chose advisors, some of whom, one in particular, who overhauled the entire administration of her state, Haugwitz, was said to look like a half-wit rather than a statesman because he had a permanent twitch and his coat was covered always with snuff stains. But she chose him, and when people said, "Why on earth have you chosen this person who looks like a half-wit?" she said, "Well, he's honest, he's completely without ambition, and he's extremely hardworking and loyal. That's all you need of a servant of the state." One could learn from that today, I think.
So she didn't shy away from using her personal traits, be it her blonde hair, engaging smile, or a fine complexion, to win people over. What causes was she trying to win people over to get them on side?
Well, first of all, loyalty to her, personal loyalty to her, and also, secondly, that they would rally round and be prepared to die for her if necessary in her armies. And she was, as you say, not above using all the sort of female guile and charm and beauty in her armory, which was formidable in her younger days to get her ends. So the Hungarians had to be virtually seduced verbally, and by her sort of lifting her infant child up in her arms when she addressed the Hungarian nobility. And they, of course, responded, being great sort of chivalrous and chauvinist males, and drew their swords and pledged to send her an army of 30,000 troops. So all that, that was part of her impression management skills.
When she spoke to the Hungarians, didn't she say something like, "We need to save our persons, our children, and our crown"? It
That's
sounds like
right.
a line taken straight out of the modern culture wars.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, the modern world is very like the 18th century. People keep saying, "Oh, we're going back to the 1930s," but for me, the Theresian 18th century is very similar to today. You have, in geopolitical terms, even the same territory being partitioned. We call it Ukraine today, but it was Poland in her day.
Interesting. What other aspects of the modern age would be quite similar to the 18th century?
Well, I think the fact that there's a massive debate now in Europe on how to modernize and finance an army, that would have been a question she would have recognized. The fact that alliances which seemed set in stone in the 18th century, no one ever thought Austria would form an alliance with France. In the same way, today, no one ever thought that Russia and America would seem to be forming an entente at the very least. So that's another sort of diplomatic similarity. And then you also have this tremendous sort of feeling that we're again returning to a period of empires, age of empires, where blocks or countries or whatever you want to call them today wish to exert their spheres of influence. And agreements as to what those spheres of influence should be are done at a high monarchical level, if you like.
Because you have all the context in which someone could ever hope for from the 18th century and perhaps even beyond, do you look at the modern world and find a sense of calm because it's a cyclical way of human nature and empires, etc.? Or do you find reason to panic?
Reason to panic. Why should one panic? Everything that's happening today we've seen before. As I said, Maria Theresa would have seen it as a very familiar kind of landscape, what's going on today. So I think cometh the hour, cometh the man, one would hope, or woman. I mean, the negotiating skills of all the countries that presently make up either the European Union, the American bloc, and the Russian bloc will be tested very severely over the coming months. But that doesn't mean that they won't reach some form of agreement. And I personally don't subscribe to the idea that the world is about to come to an end, and this collective clutching of pearls, as someone once described it, I think is probably not really necessary.
The 18th century was a very militaristic age. To what ends did she use her army and why did she need to rebuild it?
Well, she comes to the throne, as I said, at the age of 23, and her father knew that the domains would be contested precisely because she was a woman. And so he set about getting all the countries of Europe, England, France, Prussia, Saxony, Spain, to sign what was known as the Pragmatic Sanction, which essentially said, we agree that your daughter should inherit the throne rather than the daughters of the previous emperor, and rather than anyone else. Now, rather like today, where you have a situation in the Ukraine where not so long ago Mr. Putin offered to guarantee the integrity of the Ukraine and then promptly forgot about it and invaded. A similar situation happened when she came to the throne. Suddenly, Bavaria, encouraged by France, then Prussia, then Saxony, then Spain, all made a land grab. And in order to see those forces off, she needed a strong army, which she didn't have at first. But with her powers of discernment, she found these brilliant generals who could actually eventually save the day. But it was going to take a long time, a good 10 years.
Is this the time where she said she felt forsaken by the majority of Europe?
Yes, she was forsaken. The only people who were not interested in taking any of her domains were the English, but they just always counselled compromise and surrender. And indeed, 3 times she was forced to make peace with her arch rival, Frederick of Prussia, by the British, because the British were always worried that because they had Hanoverian kings, the Prussian army would march one day into Hanover. So they were very, very appeasement oriented. And And so everyone really was against her at first. But as I say, she chose brilliant advisors, and the constellation, which was so hostile to her, became much more favourable as time progressed.
So, she is a young monarch. She feels forsaken but sees off a lot of shenanigans from neighboring countries. What else then happens in the younger to middle-aged years of our Empress?
Well, I think she's pretty determined that her domains must be made fit for purpose. So she introduces a system of public health, one of the first ever in Europe, in certainly mainland Europe. And she also overhauls the educational system, providing compulsory primary school education for most of her subjects, but also insisting that at the other end of the educational scale at the universities, there should be no relaxation of high standards. And one of her, I think, most poignant remarks, again, very relevant today, given the massive overexpansion of higher education, is when she says, yes, if we lower standards, we'll end up with an academic proletariat. And we don't want that.
To what extent is she different? Obviously, in the very sense that she was a monarch and Napoleon was and wasn't. What extent is she different? Because Napoleon very much introduced a lot of laws and education, health, etc. Was she just 100 years ahead of the time?
In many ways, I think she was. I think Napoleon is much more radical, of course. And Napoleon, uh, in his military campaigns, really does remake the map of Europe. And that was never an intention of Maria Theresa. She would like always to hold on to her territories, but generally she was against expansionism or tinkering too much with the map of her domains, let alone the rest of Europe. Whereas Napoleon, of course, was uh, a revolutionary figure in every way, and although he does negotiate a concordat with the Vatican, he's very much riding a tide of French anti-clericalism.
Theresa was very depended a lot on her faith, and you said she was trained by the Jesuits. She saw her Catholic faith as very much a centerpiece of her monarchy.
Yeah, I think that's right. But she wasn't a fanatic. In fact, she said religious fanaticism is the worst sin of all. And she also said in one of her instructions to her army that religion is something you should never talk about, but try to live your life by. So she was full of common sense. And whenever the Vatican tried to impose temporal as opposed to theological rules on her, she resisted that very stiffly.
If we compare her to a modern queen, say the late Elizabeth II, who held fast very much to her Anglican faith rather than Catholic faith, do they run similar in the way that their faith influenced their decisions and influenced their day-to-day acts? Or is there a difference in which we can deduce?
I think the astrologers are the people you need to consult here because, interestingly, both Maria Theresa and the late Queen Elizabeth II shared the same star sign, which is Taurus. And traditionally, Taurian women are strong, just as the astrologers tell us Taurian men are less strong. And they have a great sense of duty and a great sense of focus, and they're very practical. And I think those are all qualities both monarchs shared. And at the same time, I think both of them would be the first to admit that they were neither of them particularly interested in intellectual, abstract ideas. So there are similarities, but whether that's the astrology at work or whether that's just the way they were brought up, with this sense of duty, this sense of trying to leave what you have inherited in a better shape than it was when you first got it. I'm sure the late Queen of England was determined to try and do that, and I think Maria Theresa obviously enjoyed the same.
There is actually, and this might be the most tenuous link of all between the two, but the deployment of Latin to great success. So obviously Theresa said to the Hungarians and spoke to them in Latin, and they promised her troops. And then Elizabeth II famously used the phrase annus horribilis when describing her 1992 year. Do you think that's too much of a tenuous link to the deployment of Latin to great success?
Well, Latin was the language of the Hungarian court, and so everyone spoke it. And if you read the lovely books of Eichendorff, you realize that even in the Biedermeier times, 2 generations after Maria Theresa, students from Prague are speaking Latin to each other very easily. So I think for Maria Theresa, she had no choice. She might have been able to master Hungarian, but Hungarian didn't really take off until a bit later as the language of the court, whereas Latin she would, of course, named from an early age. With regard to Queen Elizabeth, I think the Latin phrase horribilis sort of aptly summed up what had been a very difficult year for her, perhaps better than any English phrase might
have. So, if we are to run with the similarities, as obviously with all monarchs, is a granting of audiences. But one thing that really separates Maria is she granted audiences with members of the public. Could you give a little insight as to why she would do that?
The freie Audienz, well, of course, there was a filter. But in theory, right up until 1918, the Austrian sovereign was always available at least once a month for what was known as the freie Audienz, which was something that was, in theory, accessible to any of the subjects of her empire. And it was, as I say, carefully filtered so that lunatics and people who might resort to violence in some way were excluded. But at the same time, it afforded a way in which she could remove that sort of forbidden zone that was normally around sovereigns, particularly in the 18th century. And it helped her, I think, have a grip on what was going on, because there's no doubt that this was a highly stratified society, and despite the Enlightenment's progress and all kinds of other structures within her empire, which enabled the very poor to become acceptable at court, despite that, she felt she wanted to have her own views on what was going on, and often seeing people, meeting them in Schönbrunn Park or meeting them in the Freie Audienz, meant that she had a way in which she could keep her finger more or less on the pulse. And I think that explains why she went to such lengths to try and abolish serfdom in Bohemia, in the teeth of opposition not only from the aristocracy, but also her son, who was always considered to be the darling of the Enlightenment, but was actually a great defender of aristocratic privilege.
Can you just unpack the serfdom aspect, and certainly in the area in which you're talking about? There was an area of a lot of conflict, wasn't it?
Well, the serfs, the main problem for the serfs was that they were forced to sell what produce they had to their masters rather than export it for a much more commercial payment. So they were financially very heavily disadvantaged. And then, because of the robot as it was called, they were forced also to, if you like, a form of indented labor, where most of their working hours had to be done at the expense of the aristocracy. I mean, at the instruction of the aristocracy, their landlords. And Maria Theresa attacked all of those, what she felt indignities. And as I say, the aristocracy were deeply offended that she was essentially causing them to take the burden of financial hardship on. But that, I don't know, in a nutshell, is what the problem was, mostly in Bohemia. Hungary had a completely different, more feudal structure, which she didn't really tamper with. But in Bohemia and Austria, she made radical outcomes. And in fact, she said at one stage that the only thing that kept her going really was this desire to abolish serfdom.
So we have this desire to help her subjects in either their safety, their medical needs, to lift them up, as well as this taking on the aristocracy in certain aspects. It seems like she's quite the radical, if one was to look at it on first glance. What do you make of that?
Well, I think she is quite radical, and the people around her certainly are radical. I mean, the diplomatic revolution that Kaunitz instigated in creating an Austro-French alliance was very dramatic and seen as that, as extremely radical at the time. Um, the social contract is the creation of Maria Theresa, and that is an obvious aspect of radicalism. But because she was a devout Catholic, because occasionally that Catholicism meant that she was quite hostile to other faiths, she has been bracketed, in my view, rather too often as bigoted. Whereas I think her record is much more benign than that.
So we have this empress who has 16 children. Now, I was reading last night, I read a biography on Adam Smith, and he obviously grew up 18th century Scotland. And at the time in Kirkcaldy, where he grew up, the childbirth rates were pretty appalling. So only 1 in 4 children would make it past infancy. And I was wondering, could you give an insight into the pains in which Therese had to go through as a mother?
Well, she lost also several of her children in infancy, and I think yes, I mean she was tough though. She was physically very tough, and of course she famously contracted smallpox and recovered from it, and although it left her disfigured, so she she was someone who I think could take the the pains of childbirth very much in her stride, and she welcomed children because she saw that, particularly the absence of male heirs, what a problem it had caused for her and her father, and therefore she was not prepared just to have one male heir; she was prepared to have 3 or 4, so that the turbulence which had greeted her accession could be spared her offspring.
Do you think, though, that whilst she experienced many hardships because of the circumstances of her birth and circumstances of being a woman, though that it actually worked out for the best?
Well, it certainly worked out the best for Austria, yes, and not just for Austria. As I think the review in The Spectator you mentioned pointed out, the Belgians might be surprised to know that they were never better off than when they were ruled by Maria Theresa. Certainly, in terms of canals and roads and the income from the exchequer, they were as prosperous as any part of the world. So yes, I think things did work out for the best, and it was a long reign. 40 years is a good chunk of time in which to achieve something. and she didn't waste any of that time, although many years were spent fighting these wars. But her domestic reforms transformed Austria completely and made it capable of withstanding the great storms that lay ahead in the shape of the revolution, which sort of passed Austria mostly by, although Austria was capable of fighting 5 coalition wars against Napoleon and then eventually coming out on top. So I think that is mostly due to Maria Theresa's reforms.
It's interesting to mention the revolution because after she died, it was only just over a decade until the French Revolution really kicked off. And sort of the institution of monarchy was shaken to its core across Europe as a result. What was her legacy and how did she leave the throne in a position to successfully navigate the incoming revolution from?
Yeah, well, I think she had built this social contract. She had abolished more or less serfdom, and she had created a very, very formidable army, perhaps at its time the most formidable on mainland Europe. So those were all things which were very useful in keeping the revolution at bay. But of course, that didn't stop Napoleon defeating the Austrians and essentially pushing Austria out of Italy and out of German affairs. And in that way, he was sort of very much ahead of his time. The Metternich restoration of Austria's supremacy in Italy and Germany didn't survive for more than another generation. But Austria itself, those 5 coalition wars, 4 of which, of course, she lost, despite winning certain battles, meant that Austria, by the end, in order to stave off complete partition and reduction, they had to marry off the daughter of the emperor to Napoleon to provide him with a mare there. And that sort of bought Austria time.
These coalition wars you're talking about, what wars was she having to fight and why was she having to fight them?
Well, the coalition wars are the Napoleonic Wars, so that's her successors. But the wars she fought there were 2 wars against Frederick of Prussia and Bavaria, which are generally called in English the Wars of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748. And then you have the 7 Years' War from 1757, where France and Austria are allied against Prussia and England. But there is a clause in the Franco-Austrian agreement whereby Austria is able not to undertake any offensive activity against England. And the only time Austria is ever at war with the United Kingdom is in 1914. And that's so that otherwise they were always allies, or at least non-belligerents. So those wars essentially reduced Prussia more or less to a basket case. The 7 Years' War in particular was devastating for Prussia. Although Prussia held on to Silesia, she was more or less a failed state, and Napoleon could come along and vanquish Prussia in an afternoon in 1806, largely because the state had been so much weakened by these wars against Maria Theresa. Frederick of Prussia always used to say, fighting Maria Theresa is like dying 1,000 times a day. It never gives up.
And this 7 Years' War is quite a famous one. A lot of people would have heard it. What is it that they're fighting over? Is it territory? Is it power? What is it?
Well, for the Austrians, it's about recovering Silesia and cutting down to size Prussia. The first part of that doesn't work out, but the second part does. For the British and the French, it's about imperial conquest. And for the British, the 7 Years' War is a fantastically profitable time, not least for Britain's aspirations in India and Canada. So it is a major and decisive conflict for the expansion of the British Empire.
So if we're charting sort of from the 1700s into the Napoleonic age, what else is happening in Europe at the time? What are the Brits up to at this point? Obviously, the French are there, Prussia, etc. What's the sort of feel of Europe? Is it there's wars going on? Is there one of overall calm and peace, or is everyone just at each other's throats? Could you give a sense of what it would be like to be just a normal person in Central Europe?
A normal person in Central Europe, well, if they weren't conscripted to fight in these wars, they were having to put up with other challenges, famine being one of the major ones if the crop harvests failed. There was a particularly bad one in Bohemia, which caused thousands of deaths. And I suppose the other great changes were, but mostly limited to the cities, were certain scientific developments and medical developments. I mean, this is a time when percussion diagnostics is discovered, inoculation is discovered. Famously, when Maria Theresa's daughter Marie Antoinette goes to Paris, she finds she's the only person in the French court who's actually been inoculated against smallpox. The French were very behind the times on this. And so she partly introduces inoculation to the French. It'd been commonplace in Austria for decades. So yes, I think the average person probably was not noticing huge amounts of radical change. But Joseph, Maria Theresa's son, was a man in a hurry, determined to make the empire stronger by imposing a uniformity and consistency on it, totally at odds with his mother's pragmatism. He wanted to make the Hungarians speak German, for example. He wanted to make the Jews of Trieste, who'd spoken Italian for years, to speak German. He wanted to give all the Jews German names. He was in a hurry precisely because he sensed that there was a revolutionary powder keg round the corner, and he didn't want it to explode in Austria. He wanted it to explode somewhere else, preferably not explode at all. So he was very radical.
And how did then, when the French Revolution kicked off, how did Austria manage to avoid it to a lesser or large degree?
Well, I think largely because Maria Theresa's legacy had left the structures very much intact, and the structures were no longer oppressively feudal. It was possible, there was great social mobility in Austria. It was possible for a waitress to marry a prince of the Holy Roman Empire and suddenly be elevated to aristocratic court status. It was possible for a Nigerian slave to enter the highest court circles. And you had, and indeed, the Chancellor of Austria before Metternich was Turgot, who had first come across Maria Theresa as an orphan, rowing her across the Danube at the age of 11. And she'd taken a shine to him and paid for his education. He then became Chancellor of Austria 30 years later. I mean, these are astonishing sort of examples of social mobility. And that, I think, in any society where you have social mobility, it's much more difficult to really arouse people's frustrations, because if they see they have a stake in the system, then they might decide that the system is worth preserving.
A lot of this will be because of the social contract in which she put forward and encouraged to develop. Could you give an insight as to what that social contract was and how it benefited the wider society?
Well, I think the main part was that there wasn't a huge massive feeling of exclusion. So everyone in theory, had access to the sovereign. The sovereign was visible. When every time she took a carriage ride anywhere, she would be scattering silver coins all over the place. She was also determined that the benefits of public health should be available to all. The benefits of education should be available to all. Her schools and academies, she always insisted, should not become the preserve just of the wealthy aristocracy, and there had to be meritocracy. And the people around her supported this. Kaunitz, her chancellor, said famously, the aristocracy have to get used to being told what to do by people who are not aristocrats. This was very different to what was going on in France, or even, dare I say it, in the English Whig landscape of the 18th century. So there were, if you like, these small concessions, and they were small. I wouldn't want to exaggerate them, but nonetheless, they were there. And in the cities, you had many structures which could promote meritocracy, not just on the educational level, but you also have all the Masonic lodges, which are essentially dedicated to a very open-minded approach to human capital.
What sort of monarch was she? Was it absolute? Was it constitutional? What sort of power did she wield, and what limits did she have on her governance?
Well, it was an absolute monarchy. One should be under no illusions. I mean, she was the boss, and people could argue with her. People could persuade her. Famously, Sonnenfels, son of a Jewish rabbi, who then converted to Catholicism, and he knelt before her and in a long, impassioned speech persuaded her to abolish torture against her initial instincts, which were in favor of it. And torture was abolished in Austria before any other country in mainland Europe. So she could change her mind. That was her greatest gift. She was a pragmatic figure in that sense. She would listen to the arguments and act accordingly. But she was an absolute monarch. But we have absolute monarchies today in certain parts of the world. If you think of the Gulf, for example. And I think those people who work within absolute monarchies will be the first to tell you that absolute monarchy has also limitations. An absolute monarch may be able to sort of snap their fingers and order someone's head to be cut off, but mostly they have to listen, and there are factors which hem in even an absolute monarch in these times. And certainly Maria Theresa's absolutism was tempered by a number of factors. The main one, though, I would say, being the human element, the fact that she did listen to her advisors. And these were men of the highest caliber and, above all, highest integrity.
If I put you on the spot right now and ask you to rank how she fared against other monarchs of the century before, the same century, and the century after, how would she compare in what she achieved and how she left the nation?
Well, I think she compares very favorably. I wouldn't want to compare her with monarchs of a different century, though, because the conditions and parameters are very different. But she, certainly of the 18th century monarchs, she's infinitely superior morally, and indeed in terms of her achievement, to Frederick of Prussia. But there's a great love affair between the British and Frederick of Prussia, which I wouldn't want to pour too much cold water on. But on the other hand, her achievements over 40 years, I think, dwarf what Catherine the Great achieved in Russia. And I think you have to probably, yes, it's hard to say, but I think you have to probably go forward a century to Queen Victoria to find a figure of similar magnitude and achievement.
And if you were a subject of her as she came to the throne, and if you were a subject of her as she then died, how would your life as a Austrian subject be different from her 40 years on the throne?
Well, I think the internal domestic stability would have been noticeable. So, for example, if you were a businessman, a trader, a merchant in Trieste, you would have found the landscape considerably changed in those 40 years. What was a village was now a flourishing port with splendid new buildings to match, with tremendous commercial activity, vastly greater than 40 years earlier. In Vienna, you would have found a system of public lighting, which didn't exist 40 years earlier. And in Budapest, you would have found an area, or at least a political landscape, which was much calmer than it had been before, and that had taken full advantage of long years of prosperity, not least through trade with the Ottoman Empire, which once the Austrians stopped being at war with the Ottomans and vice versa, became a fabulously prosperous element in the empire's activities.
The subtitle of the book is The Making of the Modern Enlightenment. How did that come to be? You know, we've spoken about her values, we spoke about what she was able to achieve. Did she really accelerate the Austrian Enlightenment at the time? Or was she just a byroad in which the Enlightenment took in order to reach its goals?
Well, I think there wouldn't have been an Austrian Enlightenment without her, because she encouraged it by inviting these very gifted people to be her advisors. And it's only because she gathered around her Enlightenment figures, if you like, that the Enlightenment really took off in Vienna. And I've mentioned before the Nigerian slave who becomes a courtier, or the lady who becomes a princess. I mean, these are all aspects of the Enlightenment. And although she personally didn't care for the Masonic lodges, she didn't interfere with their activities, unlike her son, who, under the pretext of tolerating them, actually made them much more strictly controlled by the state. So it was her pragmatism, I think, and as I said earlier, her discernment in the choice of her advisors that enabled the Austrian Enlightenment really to take off and become, during those 40 years, a definite factor in the development of the Enlightenment in Europe. Not least because, although it's only recently been admitted, because a lot of post-revolutionary Enlightenment analysis tends to be of an anti-clerical nature, but it's now been admitted that there was also a Catholic Enlightenment, and that many of the great minds of the Catholic Church, not least of all the Jesuits, but also Benedictines, who founded the first school of physics in Salzburg, first school in Europe of physics, that these people were also able to operate in a space which was extremely favourable to their intellectual pursuits.
We spent the last 50 minutes talking about the merits and achievements of the great Empress. What about the merits and achievements of Richard Bassett? You have a rather splendid list of books in which you have brought out. This is just the most recent one. What can we expect from you going forward? Is there more books up the sleeve? Is there more expounding and discovering of amazing monarchs of the past or empires? Could you give us a little insight?
I've always been motivated by the fact that growing up in England and being enthusiastic about history, and I was luckily of the generation who were taught a European history GCSE A level as well as a British history GCSE A level, that in a way there was a great gap in the knowledge of many Anglo-Saxon readers when it came to Central Europe and Austria. And I've tried in whatever modest way I could to fill that gap and at least allow the educated reader a chance to come to grips with what really was going on in that part of Europe in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and now in the 18th century. I'm not sure there's very much left for me to do, really, at this stage, other than continue to develop my interests. But whether they'll reach a literary form or not remains to be seen. But I think I've contributed quite enough, probably, for people to get their teeth into.
Did you see it as sort of a lament that there was literature lacking in the areas in which you have laid out in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, or do you see that as an inspiration for you then to go on and do it yourself?
Well, it's strange. I mean, it's a paradox. The subject has encouraged some very great writers and minds and historians. A.J.P. Taylor wrote a brilliant history of the Habsburg monarchy. Edward Crankshaw wrote the last biography of Maria Theresa more than 50 years ago. And I think it's not that the subject has not been addressed, but certain parts of the subject remain less well known than I think they merit. And certainly it was high time that there was an English biography of Maria Theresa. Just as I felt in an earlier book, it was high time there should be a military history of the Habsburg army, given that it had taken part in all of the major conflicts of Europe.
Amazing. Well, Richard, the book will be in the link in the show notes for anyone to check out, as will be your other books. I would highly encourage anyone to go and check them out. Richard, you've been a great sport today. Thank you so much for coming on and for expounding the amazing and often not known about legacy in life of the Empress. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.